number of those can be found, books, CDs, videos, that sort of thing, can be found at our local Catholic religious library, Peter's Pence. Some of you are familiar with it. It's right here in Sidney, downtown in the Court Square. And they have a website. You can search for materials there, or you can stop in and look, see what they have. We do have, I brought a few copies of a sheet with some of the history-related resources that Peter's Pence has. And I know some people were picking that up on the way in, so it looks like we do have a few copies left there. I don't think we have enough for everyone, but if there are some, yeah, feel free to pick those up on your way out if you're interested. And then again, you can just stop in or go online and you can find the same things there. So there is a lot of good stuff there. And related to that, if you are interested in learning more about church history, I have all kinds of resources I can recommend to you. If you have any questions or comments or concerns about the course, I'm easy to find. My email address is easy to find online. Just Google my name and you'll come up with it, or Missy has it, or you can find it pretty easily. So I'm happy to talk to people after the class, or 6 months or a year from now when you have a church history question pop up, or you're wondering what kind of book to use for this or that, or a good video or whatever. I'm happy to answer those questions. So feel free to contact me at any point in the future. If you've been to all 4 of these classes, if you've been to just one of these classes, we're now friends. We're now part of the same family, the church history family. So feel free to treat me that way. Okay, so here we are, chapter 4, Catholicism in America. So to tell this story, we need to rewind a little bit, because we brought it up basically to the contemporary period, to the Vatican II period last time. So we need to go back to start the story of the United States. There's a map of a place you're all familiar with. Okay. And we go back to, remember in the last session we talked about the age of exploration, Christopher Columbus and forward, right? When you had the imperial powers of Europe like Portugal and France and Germany and Spain and Great Britain, all beginning to extend their reach around the world. And so that involved discovery, it involved colonization, it also involved, in many cases, evangelization. And in many of those places, in many of those times, the gospel was spread along with European culture and European political systems and so on and so forth. And we see this happen for sure in this territory, this part of North America that would end up becoming what we now call the United States. So there were other minor players, but primarily there were 3 imperial powers that were relevant to the spread of the faith and the settlement of the United States. And you had predominantly in this region, this would be the St. Lawrence Valley, the Great Lakes region, and on down the Mississippi River Valley, you had France. Okay? And France was still, at this point in time, a Catholic country. This is before the French Revolution, before France is secularized. And France is concerned not only with spreading French culture and with enhancing French wealth, but also with spreading the faith. We'll talk more about that in a second. You also had, here's the one probably most of you are most familiar with, is Great Britain, right? England, the United Kingdom, settling the eastern seaboard, what would become the United States. These are the British colonies, the 13 original colonies. You also had Spain, and Spain, especially in the south and in the southwest. New Spain was actually centered in Mexico, but it reached as far north as California, which, again, we'll talk about in a few minutes. So the French, as I mentioned, predominantly Catholic, and French missionaries then came along with French explorers and French fur traders. Missionaries were among the first Europeans to set foot in many parts of the New World, including many parts of North America and the United States. We have many saints from this period. I told you last week the Jesuits, that Order Society of Jesus founded at the time of the Catholic Reformation in the 16th century. Ignatius of Loyola, feast day today, right? Yesterday. The Jesuits keep reappearing throughout history. And They'll keep coming up as we go through the lecture tonight. But here we begin with a French Jesuit, Isaac Jogues. He was one of, I think it was 8, do I have that right? 7 or 8 Jesuits who are collectively known as the North American martyrs. And these were Jesuits, some of them priests, some of them brothers, who were martyred in the 1640s in what is now upstate New York or lower Canada, evangelizing among the Indians, in particular among the Iroquois tribes, and more specifically among the Mohawks. Now, Isaac Jogues did not directly evangelize St. Kateri, Tekakwitha, but as we know, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, right? We see this over and over again throughout history. We've talked about some of those occasions, and it's the case here in North America as well. And so St. Kateri, one of the celebrated converts of the Mohawk tribe, known as the Lily of the Mohawks, she could be seen as one of the fruits of the blood of the North American martyrs. All of these folks, by the way, really fascinating stories. If you want to delve deeper, going back to Peter's Pence, among other places, has resources on all these folks where you can read much fuller biographies of them. They each have their own unique and, in their own way, fascinating stories. St. Isaac Jogues, I guess I'll just mention it because you can actually see it there. Isaac Jogues, his devotion to spreading the gospel among the Indians was just amazing, astounding. He was nearly killed. He was tortured, and as you can see in this image, I think you can see that some of his fingers are missing. Okay, part of the torture involved removing the ends of those fingers. He returned. He was rescued, ransomed, returned to France, and then he wanted to come back and do it again. And he was given a special dispensation by the Pope, actually, to continue to say Mass, because if you don't have those fingers, by canon law, or at least canon law at the time, you couldn't, as a priest, celebrate Mass, because you needed those for consecration and so forth. But he was granted a special dispensation, which seems justified in light of the circumstances. And so he was able to continue to function as a priest and came back to the United States. And that's after that second return trip is when he lost his life in the mission field. Jesuit priests were not only missionaries, but also explorers themselves. And there's no greater example of this than Jacques Marquette. Once again, a Jesuit, told her they're going to keep coming back. Jacques Marquette a little bit later than Isaac Jogues, and he was also an evangelist, a missionary. He worked in the Great Lakes region among various Indian tribes, but he's probably best known and certainly most famous in American history for being part of the Marquette and Joliet expedition, which was 1673. They explored the Mississippi River. They were the first Europeans to chart the path of the Mississippi and find out exactly where it went as it split down the middle of the continent. Marquette and Joliet was a layman, a representative of the French government. Marquette, of course, a Catholic priest. As they floated down the Mississippi River, they got to what is today about the northern border of Louisiana. So Arkansas, Louisiana, right about there. They didn't actually go all the way to the Gulf. They got there and they started to see signs of the enemy. And so they turned back. The enemy was another imperial power, which was Spain. And so that's where we go next. Spain, as we talked about last time, Spain had a presence in the New World from very early on, from the voyage of Columbus forward. And New Spain was a vast part of the American continents. Most of South America was based in Mexico. Mexico City was its capital. But as I mentioned, it also reached up into what is now the United States. And so Spanish missionaries and explorers get credit for being the first Europeans in parts of what is now the United States, and the missionaries for laying the foundations of the faith in some of these places. So I'm sure some of you have been to St. Augustine in Florida. As you may be aware, St. Augustine is the first Catholic parish in what is now the United States. It wasn't, of course, part of the U.S. when it was founded. It was 1565. So that was long before independence. But there you can see the Basilica of St. Augustine, the cathedral for the Diocese of St. Augustine, which does not date from 1565, but it does display kind of the classic Spanish mission style. And you'll see that all over the churches of the American South and Southwest places like Florida and Texas, Mexico, Arizona, California. Anybody know what that building is? Wow, everyone does. It's a famous, it's an iconic image in American history, right? You notice that it bears some resemblance to the style there. That's because the Alamo was a mission. It began as Mission San Antonio de Valero, and then it was requisitioned or used by the Free Texan Army during its War of Independence against Mexico, famously a place where Davy Crockett and his buddies holed up and held off the Mexican forces for a time. So this is just one example, I think, and I'll give some others, but we could go on and on about the ways in which kind of the Catholic story and the broader American story interact in ways that are really interesting, I think, for us as Catholics, and unfortunately, I think is often neglected in our study of American history. Very few, or relatively few, kind of secular textbooks, and even textbooks that are used in Catholic schools, do much with the Catholic story in the United States. So I'm going to try to remedy some of that tonight. Get the Catholic story. And then the other important thing that the Spanish missionaries did was establish this mission chain, which became known as the California Missions. 21, how does it show up here? Some of you can read that. 21 missions across what is now the state of California. This was relatively late. I'll show you the first one here. Mission San Diego, 1769. This was actually when the Spanish Empire was beginning to wane. It was past its peak, but it extended into Alto California, Upper California, from its base far, far away in Mexico City, because it started to notice that other imperial powers, specifically Great Britain and Russia, were starting to trickle down the west coast of North America. So Spain got worried, and they thought, okay, we better do something to establish our presence in Alto California. And so they started establishing missions. The missions were paired with presidios. These were military compounds. Okay, again, it was the gospel and the crown, the gospel and the government that went together in many of these cases, certainly in the Spanish case. Mission San Diego was the foundation of the president of the missions in this area, who was Junipero Serra, who has been canonized, just canonized not that long ago by Pope Francis. And he was president for the foundation of the first 9 of those missions. As I said, eventually 21 of them. As you can see there, if you read those, these mission compounds served as the foundation for many of the cities in what is now California, and some of the most important cities, including San Jose, San Diego, and San Francisco. So Catholics were there at the very foundation of this country, where the French were and where the Spanish were. And again, an episode that is often neglected in our conventional study of American history, I think. There's an image of the 13 colonies. So going back to the east, we talked about France, we talked about Spain. We also have Great Britain. And this is the story, at least from a secular perspective, that we're more familiar with, the settlement of the 13 colonies. So you can see here kind of the way the territories run. So this is French territory here. You see, it's much bigger than what legacy of this French presence is, of course, French Canada, right, which is here. Quebec, Montreal still have that French flavor. But it was much bigger than that. It covered much of what is now the United States, much of what we used to call the Northwest Territory, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and so forth. This area is still under control of the Native Americans, right? It took the European powers a long time to push the Indians out. And then Spain, farther down here, in what was known at the time as West Florida, East Florida. Then the 13 colonies, so England. Now you might think, well, England, by this time, of course, the Reformation is firmly in place in England in the 17th and 18th centuries. But there is a Catholic story here as well. One little slice of the 13 colonies was Catholic. And and character. And that was Maryland. Maryland's founded, settled in 1634, when two little ships leave England, the Ark and the Dove, and they're carrying with them, I don't remember the exact numbers, I'm thinking maybe like 150 or 200 people, something like that. It's a religious mixture. It's Catholics and Protestants both, which to us may not seem terribly remarkable, but was a remarkable and unique thing for the time. Catholics and Protestants, Catholics and Anglicans were not getting along in England in the 17th century. Okay? This was part of the impetus for the founding of the colony of Maryland. George Calvert, who was better known by his honorary name Lord Baltimore, he secured from the king a grant for a colony in the New World, which lay between Virginia and New York, and would be a haven for especially Catholics. It wouldn't be exclusively Catholic, it never was, as I said. The very first ships that came over was a mixture of Protestants and Catholics. But there would be toleration of Catholicism in the Maryland colony. And this was different than was the case at the time in England in the 17th century. Catholics were persecuted. We talked about it last week. It was even worse in the 16th century, but still in the 17th century, Catholics were penalized for being Catholic, added taxation. They were prohibited from holding public office, all kinds of professions within the realm, all those kinds of things. So Catholics wanted religious freedom, and some of them were willing to come to the New World to get it. And so you have these two little ships, the Ark and the Dove. This is what you see there is a recreation of the Dove. Those ships no longer exist, but it's a recreation that you can find today at St. Mary's City in Maryland, which we can find on this map right here. So this is where naturally, if they came across the Atlantic Ocean, right, they came in here into Chesapeake Bay and began up the Potomac River, and that was the first settlement, was at St. Mary's City. And there's been a lot there, just kind of a side note, if anyone gets to, it's a little bit out of the way because you gotta like go through the DC area and then continue to drive down to Maryland. It's not really on the way to anywhere, southern Maryland, but if you get a chance, it's a really neat spot and a rare place in the sense that it's a history of, you know, one of the 13 colonies, but there's this very Catholic dimension to it. You're not going to find that in Jamestown or Massachusetts Bay or Plymouth Rock or any of those other places. And they've done a lot just in the last decade or two to reconstruct some of the chapels and things like that from the Catholic period in St. Mary's. So we have Catholics in Maryland. There was one other exception to the colonial rule. That is, that there were very few, if any, Catholics in most of the colonies, and that was Pennsylvania. Anybody have any idea why Catholics were in Pennsylvania? What's Pennsylvania? Somebody just said it. Quaker. Religiously speaking, Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers. Who said that? I want to give you credit. Good job. Okay. The Quakers. Okay. Quakers were known for, among other things, their religious toleration. They permitted other people to practice their faith, which again, to us as Americans, doesn't seem that extraordinary, but in the context of the 17th century, it was a rare thing. So that included Catholics. Now there was still discrimination against Catholics, and sometimes it was worse than others. But in general, Quaker, Pennsylvania was a hospitable, relative to other places, a hospitable place for Catholics. And so we have the two Catholic communities in the 13 colonies, insofar as there were Catholics, were in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, in particular in the Philadelphia area. So here you have one of the oldest churches in the United States. Actually, this may be the oldest church in the U.S. No? Who said? Well, St. Augustine is the first parish, but I'm not sure it's the oldest church. Is it? Okay, there you go. All right, how about the oldest church in the 13 colonies? At any rate, it dates way back there, 1733. You can see, I just put that image up there for you because you can see the way in which the architecture, the layout of the church is different. It reminds, at least for me, it reminds me more of a colonial era church, like a Protestant meeting house, something like that. But we'll get other images emphasizing the architecture in a second. So, at the time of the Revolution, 1776, just to give you a picture of the church, Catholics in Pennsylvania, Maryland, that's just about it. You in New York, they were not in the southern colonies, they were not in New England at all. New England strictly prohibited the practice of the Catholic faith. So you had, at the time of the Revolution, about 20,000, the estimates are 20 to 25,000 Catholics in the colonies, a population of 2.5 million. So, for those of you who aren't good at math, like I'm not, that's about 1%. Very small minority in what's soon to be a new country. Catholics are, as I say, have been discriminated against historically in the colonies, even in Maryland, by the way. I should mention this. By the time of the Revolution, Catholics are persecuted also in Maryland. Catholics lose control of the colony. The 7th Lord Baltimore or something like that goes back to Anglicanism. And so even in Maryland, Catholics are under disabilities, legal disabilities. The Revolution begins to change that. And there are various reasons for that, at least 3 of them. One was the experience of the Revolution itself, in particular, the fact that Catholics proved themselves to be good patriots. So the most prominent figure here is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He's from Maryland. He's one of the wealthiest men. His family has been in Maryland for a century or so. He's one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, and he stakes his entire fortune and his life on the patriot cause. He begins to write in favor of independence. Before 1776, he becomes... Oh, I'm fine. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Because I'm losing my voice. I don't think that's anything to do with water. There's too much talking. And so Charles Carroll of Carrollton becomes a celebrated figure in the Revolution. How many people have ever heard of him before tonight? Charles Carroll of Carrollton. All right. Few of you. But see, many of you haven't. And that's too bad. Because if you're an American Catholic, you ought to know the name Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He's like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. He participated in the Continental Congress. He was there for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He was the only Roman Catholic among the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, a little point of trivia, which you got to know, he was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence when he died in 1832. So you may remember the story. If you've heard, you may remember that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, one of those extraordinary coincidences of history, right? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4th of July, 1826. They were second and third, okay? Once they were done, Charles Carroll was the last one. And that's why, by the way, a little pop culture reference here. For those of you who know the film National Treasure with Nicolas Cage, some of you know that, okay? Charles Carroll appears at the beginning of that because he's the last surviving signer. And so he has this code or map or whatever it is to the treasure of the Knights Templar. I don't remember all the details, but so he's not, completely unknown outside Catholic circles. That's Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Okay, so this is the first point, kind of changing Catholic fortunes or the perception of Catholics in the American context. We've got Catholics as patriots. There were some Catholic loyalists as well, but predominantly Catholics were patriots. They fought alongside their Protestant brothers in the War for Independence, and this obviously helped to change perception. Secondly, there were Catholic allies in the War for Independence. You know your Revolution history. You know that the likelihood that the United States wins this battle with a far superior force of Great Britain against Great Britain is much diminished if they don't have an ally in France. So France's support was key, and as I mentioned earlier, France is still at this point identified with Catholicism. And so Americans start to think, well, maybe Catholicism isn't quite so anti-liberty, anti-freedom as we thought it was. And finally, there's the philosophy or the ideology of the revolution itself. Now, as Americans, we pride ourselves when we talk about, the 4th of July, we talk about independence. What do we talk about? Freedom, liberty, right? That was the purpose. That was the purpose of all that stuff in 1776, freedom. And it was a rallying cry, and it was popular, and to some again, it was actually taken to heart. And religious liberty was a real motivation for the revolution. And some Americans began thinking about it along these lines, that, okay, if I'm fighting for religious liberty for myself, as a Puritan, as an Anglican, as a Quaker, whatever it is, maybe we ought to extend that to other faith traditions, including Roman Catholicism. So this helps to enshrine in our Constitution, eventually, with the Bill of Rights. The very first in the Bill of Rights is what? The First Amendment, which protects the freedom of religion, among other things. And Catholics were able to capitalize on this. Now, there was still a process as anti-Catholicism kind of dissipated in the colonies over the next few decades, and as some of the restrictions on Catholics holding public office and things like that gradually faded away. And in fact, anti-Catholicism in American culture never completely goes away. It's still with us, okay? But it kind of, there are ups and downs in church history. We'll talk more about that. But again, relatively speaking, Catholics after the Revolution are relatively well off in the United States, relatively welcome. And so what we see is that the Catholic Church begins to grow and to expand. And a big part of this story is the role of women religious. Now, I mentioned last week, I think it was, when we talked about the founding of the Ursulines, I said this was a new kind of model of women's religious life, no longer just a contemplative life, but you have this active life in the world. As it turns out, this model of women's religious life was a godsend, the perfect instrument to spread the faith, to spread Catholic culture in a new, wild, frontier place like the United States, because sisters then had flexibility to go out onto the frontier, to found institutions like schools and orphanages and hospitals in a way that they would not have before. And so you see up there is a person most of you have heard of before, Elizabeth Ann Seton. She's a great example, a great figure of kind of Catholic assimilation in early American life, because she was herself an American in the sense that some other Catholics were not. By that I mean she was actually born in the United States. I mean, 1774 wasn't yet the U.S., but she was born in New York, and she was born into an Episcopalian family. So this is very American, okay? And yet, she converts, 1804, I think it is, 1804, she converts to Catholicism. There's a whole story there. If you don't know it, look it up. Great story. The end result being that Elizabeth Ann Seton founds a religious order, the Sisters of Charity, which had enormous impact on American history, and in particular the history of the church in this area. I mentioned before, the Sisters of Charity have had a presence here at Layman and in Sidney for many, many years. And again, just an example of the role of women religious, not just the Sisters of Charity, but many other religious orders in founding institutions. Elizabeth Ann Seton usually pointed to as one of the pioneers of Catholic education, Catholic schools in this country. So schooling, just one of those areas in which Catholic sisters contributed so much. One of Elizabeth Ann Seton's friends was a guy named John Carroll. John Carroll, yes, related to Charles Carroll, they're cousins of some sort, not brothers, but cousins. John Carroll was the first bishop of the United States. He was working as a missionary here when the U.S. achieved independence, and then in 1789 the Pope decided it's time to create a diocese for this new country. It could no longer be under the diocese, well, no longer under the propagation of the faith, the congregation, or under the diocese, and so it established the first diocese, 1789, which was in the city of, anybody know? Baltimore, right, first diocese, 1789. At the same time, Georgetown College. Oh, by the way, John Carroll was, guess what? A Jesuit. Okay? Now, a little wrinkle in that story. John Carroll was not a Jesuit when he was made a bishop, because the Jesuit order had been suppressed by the Pope. It was suppressed for about 30 years, right around the time of the American Revolution. So that's a whole other story. But they came back. You know, there are still Jesuits around. So they were suppressed by the Pope, and then they were rehabilitated by the Pope. Georgetown College, now Georgetown University, in the District of Columbia, the first Catholic college in the country, founded by John Carroll. He also built the first Catholic cathedral, of course, in Baltimore, and there you can see a picture of it. Does that look like a Gothic church to you? No. No. Maybe the spires a little bit, but generally speaking, not Gothic. And so this goes back to what I was saying 2 weeks ago, right? That we think about Gothic churches as being the model of churches because there was this Gothic revival in the United States in the 19th century. And I said in the early 19th century, the churches weren't Gothic. And see, I was telling the truth. There's evidence of it. And there's another building from around the same period. Anybody know what that is? It's not the White House, but you're on the right track. It's the Capitol, okay? The Capitol in a kind of earlier version of it. And if it looks a little bit like that, it's probably not coincidence because it was the same architect who did both of them. So John Carroll wanted an American building built in the classical style, which was the style that was all the rage at the time and would characterize many of the buildings in Washington, D.C., for example. And after Baltimore, in 1808, as the church began to grow and to expand, there were 4 new dioceses created: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Bardstown, Kentucky, of all places. Why Bardstown? Because a lot of those people in Maryland, a lot of those Catholics, they started moving west. This is the story of American history, right? We moved west. Remember the Cumberland Road? Does that ring a bell? There's a Cumberland Gap and the Cumberland Road that let people from the East Coast move to the west, and many of them went to Kentucky, and so many of these Maryland Catholics settled in Kentucky around Bardstown, so that was one of the dioceses. It no longer exists as Bardstown. It's now the Diocese of Louisville. And so this church, which was a cathedral in 1808, or whenever it was built around there, is no longer, is now a proto-cathedral. But again, the architecture, right? Early 19th century, that's not a Gothic church. So the nature of the Catholic Church at this point in time is one of, it's rudimentary, you might say. Okay? The organization, the institutions are thin, few and far between. The life of priests, the Catholic life in general, very different from the way we experience it today. You're all reading that quotation. You get to the end of that, see if you process that, what he's talking about. Okay? This is actually late 19th century, so this is later on. This is a priest who's working in the South. But the priests got around how? By walking or by horseback. They were circuit riders. Most of the early priests in the United States were circuit riders. They didn't have a parish. They weren't stationed at one rectory somewhere. Instead, they rode around and visited lots of different parishes, lots of different flocks all over the place. As you can see there, a penalty of very shallow genuflection for reaction. If you've ridden a horse, you know what I'm talking about. Father Stephen Baden there on the right, he's a great figure because he's an early missionary priest in this area. Okay, what will become the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, all of this area. It's estimated that he rode 100,000 miles on horseback over the course of his career. So these guys spent a lot of time on the road, so to speak. The character of the church in the United States began to change about mid-19th century. So predominantly what we had, and you saw some of the figures there. You saw people like Charles Carroll and Elizabeth Ann Seton. You had people of British descent who were English speakers, who were peculiar because of their faith. Those people weren't Catholic. But culturally, they fit in. They spoke the same language, they wore the same clothes, they had the same history. Okay? That starts to change in the mid-19th century. In the 1840s, in Ireland, there's a potato famine. Now, the Irish people are subsisting almost entirely on potatoes in the 1840s. Okay? That is their sole staple crop. There's a blight that hits, and so this is a disaster. 1 million Irish starved to death. 1.8 million over roughly the decade 1840 to 1850. 1.8 million Irish people leave Ireland for the United States. Another couple million leave for other places. So the island, I think the island started out with like 5 million or something. And by the end of the 1840s, it was down to 1 million. Something like that. But this had the effect of changing the character of the church in the United States. Because imagine 1.8 million new Irish Catholics coming into a country where the church was very small, probably still less than 1 million Catholics here in 1840. So it just overwhelmed and changed the composition of the church. And at the same time, German Catholics are also coming in. I put these immigration numbers up there for you just to kind of get a sense of where the immigration was coming from in these periods. A lot of German immigration was not Catholic, but maybe 30 to 40% of it was Catholic. And so this was another big group here relatively early in the game, in the mid-19th century. The Irish and the Germans. And so the Irish, of course, they do speak English, most of them, but still culturally they're different from the British. They come out of this deeply Catholic country. They tend to be poor. That's the people who were leaving Ireland. They were poor, and so they come into a church, populated by people like Charles Carroll, who's not poor. He's not working class. And so the composition of the church begins to change. German Catholics, of course, again, culturally different. Not quite as poor in general as the Irish, but speaking a different language, having their own traditions, and so on. So the church begins to become, in mid-1840s, the church begins to become an immigrant church. In fact, if you see a lot of histories of the church in the 19th century, the chapter on the 19th century or a book on the 19th century will be called The Immigrant Church. It really stamped the Catholic Church in this country during that century. Let me move forward. So this is the Irish and the Germans I mentioned. Immigrants continue to come throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, but the composition starts to change. Now, as you look down through those numbers, you'll see there's still large numbers of Irish and Germans coming, but there's also some countries that have hardly been on the radar before, that are coming in large numbers. Austria-Hungary, now that one's a little bit hard to comprehend because this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included about 8 or 9 or 10 modern-day countries. Included among that would be part of Poland. Okay, so if you think Polish Catholic immigrants, they'd be coming from Austria-Hungary. They would be included in that number. The USSR would also, some of those would be Polish. And then Italy, you see, starting to increase there by 1890. I don't have the numbers for the next 2 decades, but if you were to see the next 2 decades, you'd see these numbers accelerate. Polish and Italian and Southern European immigration really takes off. And so this, in turn, and you still have an immigrant church, but you start to have a different kind of immigrant church. Because if you know anything about Italian or Polish Catholic customs, they look different from German and Irish, right? They have different saints they're devoted to. They have different kinds of processions, and so on and so forth. And so all of these start to become part of, sometimes called the melting pot, the salad bowl of American culture. And within that melting pot of American culture, there's kind of a Catholic culture that is its own melting pot. And this starts to change the character of the church in all kinds of ways. So I like this image because it really brings, it highlights the fact those are, I think I'm right about this, those are Sisters of Charity from sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century. Now, if you think back to that image of Elizabeth Ann Seton, I think I have her. Let me double check that. I think I have her in habit, right? Yeah, that's the right one. Yeah, that is the habit of the Sisters of Charity in 1821 or in 1810 or whatever that is. Okay, that is the habit of the Sisters of Charity, and this is just one. This is just one kind of small, maybe in some ways unimportant example, but as immigrants, first, second generation immigrants begin to dominate the Catholic Church in the United States, it becomes less American, if you want to put it that way, and more European. Now, of course, it's still American, but just kind of culturally, it begins to identify, starts to identify more and more with European Catholicism. And the habit is an example of that. The habit that Elizabeth Ann Seton wore, that you saw up there just a minute ago, that was classic American dress. Okay? She looked like an American lady would have in the early 19th century. Now here, with the Sisters of Charity, with the coronet, as it's called, okay, the flying nun kind of thing, this is identified European. This looks really strange to Americans. Well, it's a little strange to us, right? But it looks really strange to Protestant Americans in the 19th century. And so the church starts to take on more of the hue of a kind of European Catholicism, be that French or Italian or German or whatever. Francis Xavier Cabrini, a good example of this. She is not born in the United States. She is the first American citizen to be canonized, but she was born in Italy. Okay? She's an Italian. Comes over, does lots of missionary work, founds lots of Catholic institutions, continues what I talked about earlier with Elizabeth Ann Seton and the Sisters of Charity, continues that work, this time, though, farther west, especially in the Midwest and on the West Coast. Actually, she's all over. She's on the East Coast as well. Founding these charitable institutions, schools, and so forth that serve such an important part, such an important role in the development of the country and of the church in particular. One more dimension of this, recall that I talked about last week, the Marian revival in France in the 19th century. Do you remember that? I talked about the apparition of Lourdes and La Salette and the miraculous medal. Well, that Marian devotion, that Marian revival is also imported to the United States. And this is an example. Anybody know who Father Edward Soren is before I give it away? Oh, no, of course you should. He founded a little humble school in northern Indiana around two lakes that were known as became known as Notre Dame du Lac, Notre Dame of the Lakes, or Lady of the Lakes, and developed into the preeminent Catholic university in this country. And guess what's at Notre Dame? The Lourdes Grotto. Okay, this Father Edward Soren was a Holy Cross father from France, and so he brought with him his French sensibilities, including Marian devotion, and this has become part and parcel of the culture of Notre Dame. And then finally, on this point, there's St. Patrick Cathedral, started built over the course of 1858 to 1879. There you have a Gothic church, okay? Very Gothic. Archbishop John Hughes is the one who started it. Hughes was born in Ireland, okay? Not in the United States. And so he wanted a more triumphal, more European-looking style of cathedral, and he got it in St. Patrick's. There was an older St. Patrick's with a whole different style that predated. Okay, so you get the point. An immigrant church, kind of changing character, changing composition over time. This is, I could spend a lot of time with these slides because you can kind of see the way, just one second. You can kind of see the way in which, just by following this geography, you can see the way in which the growth of the Catholic Church really mirrored the growth of the United States. You can talk about this in all sorts of ways. We don't have time, so I'm just going to flip through these quickly, and you can enjoy them as we go. But first, Mrs. Smith has a question.
Just another comment is that in addition to all the immigrants, there were many European priests also after the French Revolution that came to the United States, contributed to that European culture.
That's exactly right. There were a lot of French priests, a lot of bishops in the early and mid-19th century were French, a lot of American bishops, far more than would be proportional to the population of French Catholics in the United States. And that is in part a function of the French Revolution, which spurred all these priests to leave the country, and a lot of them came to the United States. And the question of the kind of the ethnic leadership of the country, of the church in the U.S., was a thorny question in the 19th century, because wherever you had large numbers of Italians or Poles or Irish or whatever, they didn't want to be under a German bishop. Okay? Germans didn't want to be under Irish bishops. And so there's all kinds of crazy and not always edifying, but sometimes funny stories about these ethnic groups not getting along. So there's Catholic diocese in 1790, as you just learned, 1789, Baltimore, that's it. So 1790, we've got one. Okay, just focusing on the U.S., not Mexico, even though it's included in that, on that map. 1810, I told you there were a few more. And New Orleans has been added, and New Orleans already existed as a diocese shortly after, or at the time of the Revolution, I think, but it wasn't part of the United States, because it became part of the United States with the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, right? So we kind of acquired a big chunk of Catholic land, you might say. 1830, you can see it begins to spread west. The frontier is moving west. The Northwest Territory and the Great Lakes region in particular, growing during that period. Germans, the so-called German Triangle. Milwaukee and St. Louis and Cincinnati. Lots and lots of Germans settled in that area, so that's why you see some of these dioceses forming. In the Great Lakes Midwest, 1870, West Coast, you start to see that, a little bit 1850. Big thing happened in California in 1848, right? Gold. So people start to move west, and that's where you start to see the California dioceses. Finally, in 1900, now see, still at this point, look at the Great Plains. Great Plains Midwest. There's nothing there. Indians are still there. But that changes dramatically from 1870 to 1890. The Indians have been pushed into reservations. That area is opened up to white settlement, and you've got Catholic immigrants and Catholics from the East settling in places like Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and so you start to see dioceses established in those places. 1900, in case you didn't figure it out, the purple is an archdiocese, the red are dioceses. 1920 continues to grow, more of the west coast. 1940, 60, see lots of growth, 40 to 60, you know that. The baby boom and all that. Catholics really start to sell 60 to 80, you see the growth. Very little in the Northwest and Great Lakes. The old Catholic regions, not so much. West Coast, not so much. But, well, I guess you still have some of the West Coast, but especially South and Southwest. You see them added there in 1980 and 2000. That's what it looks like. So Catholics are growing as a percentage of the Catholic population. The church is growing. Obviously, you see that illustrated pretty graphically on that map, and yet there remain questions, there remain problems, there remain tensions within American culture, political life, social life, about the place of Catholics in the United States. And there are efforts from time to time. We could do a whole series of sessions on anti-Catholicism in American life. It's a long story, but just to touch on a couple of them. So still in the 20th century, 1920s is actually generally seen as one of the kind of flashpoints in the history of anti-Catholicism. You see the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, in 1920. Okay, this organization founded after the Civil War. People tend to think about it as an anti-black, as a racist organization. It is that, to be sure, but it's much more than that. It's a nativist organization, meaning that they are also against immigrants, and included in that, immigrants and Catholics, they're all lumped together. Okay, Catholicism is immigrant faith. They're not native, small n, Native American. And so in the 1920s, you start to see efforts once again to push back against this growing Catholic population. Catholics have started to gain political power. They're starting to be a threat to the old American order. And so in the state of Oregon, a law is passed that in essence requires all school-age children to attend public schools. And what that also means is that Catholic schools and other private schools are banned, abolished. Well, the Catholic schools already existing in Oregon, remember our friends the nuns? We've got Sisters of Providence and others who are in Oregon. They've established Catholic schools. They fight back and take it to court, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This Supreme Court decision in 1925, Pierce v. Society of Sisters. I've got a little quote from it there. I think one of the best lines in the history of Supreme Court jurisprudence in this country: the child is not the mere creature of the state. Okay, and so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the sisters. And they said the state does not have the authority to compel one kind of education, a secular education of all children. Instead, parents have the right to provide for education. And so this was an important, obviously, watershed in the history of American Catholic education, because if this goes the other way, it essentially destroys at least Catholic elementary education.
Can you just go back real quick?
Yes,
I just want
that's fine.
okay.
You can mark it down while I start talking. So, as I mentioned, Catholic political strength is gaining, in particular in certain places where Catholics are a large percentage of the population. The state of New York is one of those places. Massachusetts is one of those places. In fact, the mayor's office of New York, the mayor's office of Boston, basically become Catholic institutions. Beginning in the late 19th century, Catholics hold those places for about a century. One of these New York Catholics is a guy named Al Smith. In 1928, he'd been the governor of New York for 3 or 4 terms at that point. In 1928, he becomes the first Roman Catholic to be nominated by a major party to be their candidate for president of the United States. He runs in 1928. Do we have a President Al Smith in our history? No. So he didn't win, did he? He lost. Herbert Hoover got beaten pretty badly. But that's okay, because Hoover got to enjoy the Great Depression because of that. So Catholics didn't get blamed for that. But religion was a big part of the 1928 election. It came up, and people began to question it. They said, I don't know. Catholics are already strong in New York and New England and in Chicago and in Cleveland and places like this, and I don't know if we want a Catholic to be president of the United States. And it became a very contentious issue. Some people think Al Smith lost the election because he was Catholic. You know, presidential elections, there are so many factors. Who knows? There are a lot of other things going on. But it certainly played an important role. And many Catholics took it as a rebuke. When Al Smith lost, they thought, these are American Protestants telling us, you know, you're welcome here, but only to a certain degree. Not to be president. And so here's another great line, I think. This was a Paulist priest, James Gillis, in his journal, The Catholic World. He wrote an editorial after the election, and he said, you know, okay, Catholics have been beaten down, but we will not wither up and blow away. Kind of captures the attitude of Catholics at the time. And there were other things going on in Catholic culture in the 1920s, and here's one of them. And it may seem like a trivial example, but I think it's actually kind of important, at least this kind of thing. The Notre Dame football team, going back to Notre Dame, the 1920s, they get a new coach, Newt Rockne. He's actually not Catholic. It's one of the little ironies of history, but he brings this little football team from this little school in Indiana to national prominence. And this team starts beating the powerhouses of the day, like University of Michigan and these other secular and Protestant schools. And today it all seems kind of silly, right? I mean, Notre Dame beats, it's not like a Catholic Protestant thing, but it was very much thought about that way, especially among Catholics in the 1920s, because they were self-conscious about it. And so you can see the quote there from a Jesuit historian who talks about this, the way Catholics identified with the success of the Notre Dame football team. This kind of phenomenon reached American film screens in the 1940s with this movie, Rockne All-American, and the star player on Notre Dame was a guy named George Kip. He was played by the actor that you see on the left, who you can identify, right? Everybody know who that is? There was a young movie star, Ronald Reagan, right? Win-win for the giver. And Catholics started appearing all over movie screens in the United States in the 1930s and 40s, and predominantly in a positive fashion. So you see the way in which American culture is gradually coming to terms with this strong Catholic presence. Guess what? A positive portrayal of priests and nuns actually plays well at the box office, especially in big cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, Boston, where there's lots of Catholics. So you get the big movie stars of the day playing parts, Bergman, Spencer Tracy, and the rest. And then in the 1950s, the unlikeliest of all things, you have this, guy in Episcopal garments, Archbishop Fulton Sheen. He gets his start in Catholic radio in the 20s and 30s. He's a big name in radio. But in the 1950s, of course, TV starts to dominate the scene. In 1952, one of the networks is desperate. They've got the Milton Berle show, I guess. I don't know what that is. Maybe some of you really old-timers remember that. That's before my time. But it was the most popular show on TV at the time, and so the slot adjacent it, whatever that was, let's say Tuesday 8 p.m., whatever it was the graveyard slot. Okay? It's where you put shows you didn't think were going to succeed anyway. So ABC, I think it was, decided to take a risk, and they threw this Catholic priest on there in the Milton Berle slot, and he got up there and he had a chalkboard and started talking about stuff. Not so much specifically Catholic stuff, I don't think, but just kind of faith and spirituality and philosophy and things like that. And it was a big hit. And the Fulton Sheen show was, what was it called? What was it called, the Fulton Sheen show? Life is Worth Living, right? Yeah, Life is Worth Living. It was the most popular show in the 1950s. 30 million people per week tuned in to watch this Catholic priest, not just Catholics.
Is he from Ohio?
He is from Peoria, Illinois. I think he was born in Peoria. I'm not sure, but that's where he was. He was ordained priest for Peoria. And then it's an interesting question because he ended up in New York. You know about this? His cause for canonization has been opened, and there's been a fight for many years between the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Peoria about where his remains are going to end up. I think it was finally maybe just settled in the last month. They're going to be in Peoria. But it's been this, again, kind of, not edifying fight between these two dioceses. Because they figure he's going to be a saint, they want to have a shrine and all that. So, anyway. That's Fulton Sheen. And then the culmination of all this, Catholic rise to prominence, we have the second Catholic candidate for president in 1960, and the outcome is, of course, different. And John F. Kennedy wins election, becomes the first Catholic president in United States history. But there is, I'm trying to decide if I do this or not. Well, I'll put it up there, you can read it at least. You might say, this is seen as a triumph. Most Catholics, the vast majority of Catholics voted for John F. Kennedy, and most Catholics saw this as a kind of, well, this is within all of our memories, the way African Americans saw the election of Barack Obama, right? It was, okay, finally, we've been accepted in American society. We've reached the apex of American life, power within American politics. But you might say that there was a cost to this, or at least you could say there's a trade-off. Or you could say, well, the tensions, yeah, John F. Kennedy's elected president, but the tension between Catholicism and American culture, dominant American culture, be that Protestant, secular, whatever it is, that tension hasn't entirely disappeared. And you see this in one of the famous speeches in American political history. It's a great address, politically brilliant address that Kennedy gave in 1960. This is during the presidential campaign. And he speaks to a gathering of Protestant ministers in Houston Ministerial Association. And he addresses head-on this big contentious issue, the religious issue. And he says, here's what it means that I'm Catholic, and here's what it doesn't mean. And you can see as you read through there, the way in which he kind of tries to walk a fine line between not disavowing his Catholicism, not saying, I'm not going to be Catholic, but at the same time saying, I'm not going to be too Catholic. I'm not going to take marching orders from the Pope or from bishops. I'm just going to go by, my conscience and my beliefs and so forth. Now, there's a way in which that can be understood in perfectly legitimate, valid terms, right? It means true. In general, the popes and bishops shouldn't be, and we don't want them meddling in political questions. At the same time, there's a way in which that can be seen when he uses the terms like an absolute separation of church and state. There's a way in which that can be seen as, okay, you've got political life here in one silo, and you've got faith life, religious life, theology, and the teachings of the church in another silo. And the two aren't going to meet. Okay? And we've seen that play out, I think, in American politics and culture over the last, what is that? Almost 60 years now, in ways that aren't entirely positive. And so even at this moment of triumph for Catholics in American life, there's still kind of this shadow on it, I would say. One of the figures associated with John F. Kennedy at the time of the election is John Courtney Murray, who is, guess what, a Jesuit. See, they're not going away. John Courtney Murray appears on the cover of Time magazine in December of 1960. So this is a month after the election of the first Catholic president. Because John Courtney Murray is the prominent theologian who has been arguing for a different understanding of the relationship between church and state, especially in the American context, in a way in which John F. Kennedy picks up on and uses in his speech. And so Time features John Courtney Murray, and this provides the transition point because John Courtney Murray becomes one of the Haredi, one of the theological experts who goes to the Second Vatican Council just a couple of years later and he is an important influence on one of the great documents from the Council, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, which kind of defines in a new way this relationship between church and state. So we don't have time to go into all that. I'll just, I think I'm just going to leave it at that. There are 16 documents coming out of Vatican II. Those are the 4 major constitutions. Okay? I guess I'll just say this. Focus on the first one. As far as the life of the average Catholic in the pew, all of these documents, all of them are important. All of them have, in some respects, new and interesting material in them, and all of them have influenced the way in which the Catholic Church, in our own period, contemporary Catholic Church, has operated, the way it looks. But I would say the first one, in terms of the experience of Catholics in the pew, the first one is the one that really shaped our world. Because this is the one that introduced the possibility of English, the vernacular language. It had been a completely Latin Mass. It had been basically the same Mass from the Council of Trent, at least the Council of Trent, 16th century, all the way down to the late 20th century. And all of a sudden, lots of things changed in the liturgy. Now, it's an open question how much of that was actually called for by the document. But anyway, we'll leave that aside. Have that debate some other time. But the point is, it certainly did open up the possibility of changes, more dialogue in the liturgy, more English, more congregational singing, lots and lots of things that we take for granted. If you grew up in the post-Vatican II church, as I did, if you're a convert in the post-Vatican II church, this is all you've known is the new Mass that came out of the Second Vatican Council. That's a function of this huge religious event in the 1960s. If you are at Holy Angels, you've had the opportunity to experience the old Mass on some occasions. So some of you have seen that. If you've been to one of the high Masses, or you've been to that, Wednesday 8 a.m. Mass, or some of those, that's what the Mass looked like for everyone all over the Catholic world before the Second Vatican Council. So, Vatican II, we'll end it there. Okay? Questions, comments about any of this? And we can talk about post-Vatican II period if you want to. I'm happy to talk about that. But formally, we'll bring it to a conclusion with that. Okay, yes, here and then.
My question was on the Jesuits. I knew that they had fallen out of favor and were suppressed by the Pope.
Yeah.
But I have never heard why. What did they do? What happened there?
Yeah. They didn't really do anything. They were just, it was the politics of the time, really. There was, as far as I'm aware, there was no theological dimension to it really at all. It wasn't that they were teaching his heresy, suspected of teaching heresy. It was nothing like that. It was basically that they were getting too powerful as an institution in and of themselves. Almost you might say they were, from the perspective of their enemies, they were creating a new church, a Jesuit church, which had its own finances, it had its own structure, it had its own organization, its own leadership, it had its own colonies. I mean, there were the Jesuit reductions in South America, and it was a political and economic power. It's hard for us to imagine because we don't think about religious orders this way anymore because none of them are really like that. I guess maybe some people talk about like the Legionaries of Christ or the List Dei. If you're familiar with those, I'm not going to go into that, but if you happen to be familiar with those, maybe it's something kind of parallel to that. The idea that there's this kind of, almost a separate church rising up within the church. The Jesuits were very, very powerful and wealthy in the late 18th century. And so that was a threat to, I think the King of France, for example, I forget exactly who it was, but there were various monarchs who didn't like what the Jesuits were doing. So they put pressure on the Pope to suppress them. And I think the Pope at the time, who was it? Urban something or other. I don't know. Check that. Andy, checking that for me? I think he had some personal reasons, for being against the Jesuits as well. So that's what was behind it. It was basically a political move. And 30 years later, they were completely rehabilitated, and they came back stronger than ever. So that's that story.
Yeah. 4 weeks ago, you started with the tombstone thing. Schmiesing.
Yeah.
And Gene has a book that is a collection of writings of early settler in Mercer County. What kind of fascinated me is they came through Baltimore. you have, how did the Catholics get in this area? You kind of mentioned the triangle,
Yeah.
large, but do you know where the Catholics, most of them are German.
Right.
How did they get?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I know the full answer to that. I flashed up there earlier the slide of Ellis Island. Immigrants normally came through just a couple of different ports of entry. Ellis Island was,
Well, this would have been 1820s.
Yeah, still, well,
Prior to
Ellis Island was later than the 1820s.
Yes.
So, yeah, so at that point, I'm trying to think of the individual stories I know of. I'm thinking of the religious, when, say, priests and nuns came over, like the French missionary priests we were talking about, it seems as though they always came through New York. Baltimore, yeah, there were some Baltimore, New York, so probably the ports of the East Coast. I don't remember ever hearing anything landing in Philadelphia, so I don't know. I don't think there was, I don't know if this is where your question is going or not, but
Just how did people get here?
okay.
How did the
I wasn't
Catholics-
sure if maybe you were asking about the legal question, because it's so different now.
I
You know, there was no, there were no quotas. Look, can I use that as a springboard, because I haven't talked about this at all yet. So immigration is so massive in the 19th century, in part because there are no quotas. We're used to there being, you know, legal immigration now, and illegal immigration. It's a big debate, right? There was no such thing in the 19th century. You just came in. Now, if you had certain diseases or something, or you were considered a political radical, a socialist or something like that, you might be an anarchist, you might be kept out. But generally speaking, you just came in. That changed dramatically in the 1920s when there were immigration quotas. I talked about anti-Catholicism and nativism in the 1920s. This was another kind of indicator of that. Immigration, strict immigration controls imposed for the first time in the 1920s. And it was at that point that Catholic immigration declined precipitously. And it only came back again in 1965, and that was opened up. And then you had a different set of immigrants coming in. A lot of Latin Americans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans. So still a lot of Catholic immigrants, but from a whole different part of the world. So going back to what your question actually was, yeah, they would come in. And most of the stories I see, they come in from places like New York and Baltimore, and then it's a long trip out to the frontier, wherever they're going to end up. There were roads across Pennsylvania. What is now the Pennsylvania Turnpike. That started out as a log road. And then they came, that's where they ended up. So around Pittsburgh, they got on the Ohio River and floated down to Cincinnati, and then they came up to Cincinnati. Right. Yeah. So that was predominantly the route. But that, of course, changed over time. You know, there were railroads built. Once there were railroads, that became the way of getting out west. There were canals for a time, also around here. That became a means of transportation. So in all of those ways.
You know, we went to a presentation in Knoxville. Someone came and talked about the people who settled there. And they basically, people from Knoxville, New Bremen, or North Minster, all came from the same part of Germany. They didn't talk to each other in Germany.
Yeah.
They came here to the United States.
Yeah.
And we set up their communities, didn't talk to each other here.
Yeah.
And it was like that practically in the 60s.
Yeah.
People who lived there pretending.
Right. Yep. That's another good point. That's exactly true. But the thing of it is, I mean, you know, that's our experience. But the fact is that actually was not unusual. That was a very common immigration pattern. And that's why you have the rise of what they call, we think of ghetto as like inner city African American or something. Ghetto originated in cities in Europe where there were Jewish enclaves. It's just a term for a group of people basically of shared ethnicity or religion or culture of occupied a particular area. And there were Catholic ghettos. There were German and Irish and Polish ghettos that sprang up in American cities. And you can imagine, if you're, you know, an Italian coming over in 1890, you don't know English, you've never been to the United States, they don't have TV, they don't have radio, probably not even reading newspapers. They don't know anything about the U.S. They just know it's this land of opportunity. And, you know, my Uncle Louis went there 10 years ago, and we get letters from him, and he's doing great. So I'm headed over. But where am I going? I'm going to where my Uncle Louis is. That's where I'm going. So that was basically the way it worked. You went to the places where there had been, for whatever reason, that ethnicity had established itself.
They didn't get help there.
Right. That's part of it as well. That gives you, right, that gives you the first step.
Well, hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed, that's right. It's still same patterns of immigration now. Yeah, exactly right. Human nature. Oh, wait, son, you had one that I forgot about. You still have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, during the Revolution, and Carol, it's first name, but,
Charles?
when they were working on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, do you know if there was any kind of input? Did they accept him well as a Catholic? Was there?
Yeah, he was accepted because by the time of the Declaration, he had already kind of proven his patriot bona fides. In the period leading up to the Revolution, I kind of just mentioned it very briefly, didn't really explain. He initially became prominent as a patriot because he wrote pieces in one of the Maryland newspapers defending the idea of independence. And this was kind of the form of debate. Think about presidential debates today, right? They're on TV. That's the kind of, at the time, it was newspapers. People would debate in newspapers. And so he had a loyalist or a royalist or a British, whatever you want to call it, partisan of Britain, who was arguing against him. And in that exchange, they would use pen names, but gradually the true identity would become known. And so this, his opponent in the debate did kind of make hints at the fact that this was a Catholic and kind of try to use that against him. Just as a debate point, that this guy, is suspect because after all, his religion is even, truly British or whatever the argument was. So in that sense, it was kind of raised as an issue, but I think he was fully accepted as a revolutionary, as a patriot by all of the, key people at the time of the revolution. Mom, you're up.
Could you just review how many Americans, either citizens or foreign-born, have become saints in the church?
It's hard to keep track of because it's changing all the time. So I can tell you that Theodore Guerin, who I talk about in some versions of this, Sister of Providence from Indiana, she was the 8th American saint. That was like 2005-ish, maybe. There have been some since then. So I'm just going to guess it's maybe a dozen saints. Saints only, not blessed. Blessed and venerable is a whole bunch more. But that's my guess. Someone can look that up and check my numbers. I have one more slide that I didn't want to neglect getting to, so there it is. There's at least one person in this room who has a birthday today. Anybody else? Any other birthdays August 1st? Okay. I just had to do that. That's my wife, in case anybody doesn't know that. She's 30 or 40 something, I'm not sure. It's my dad tomorrow. It's her 91st. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Throughout history, has the priesthood always been celibate?
Has the priesthood always been celibate? Somebody was talking about, okay, we were talking about that after one of the sessions. The answer is no. It's pretty obvious from Scripture that in the first century, a lot of the priests and bishops, the apostles were the first bishops. We know some of them. I mean, we know with certainty that Peter was married because he had a mother-in-law. So it was a gradual development. There's some debate about exactly when it became the norm or when it was required, and it's one of those things where the documentation, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on this subject. As far as I know, the documentation isn't entirely complete, so we don't know for sure. What I've seen is like by the 7th, 8th centuries, it was the norm in the Western church. Now remember, there was a division brewing between West and East, almost from the beginning of Christianity. We talk about the Great Eastern Schism in the 11th century, but that division was brewing already. And there were already differences in practice by the 7th and 8th century between East and West. So in the East, celibacy never became, I don't want to say never became the norm, it never became mandated that priests be celibate. Bishops have to be celibate in most of the Eastern churches. But you could I think you could be married and then ordain, right? But if once you're ordained, you can choose celibacy as part of your package of the priestly life. You can be ordained as a celibate man, and then you're not permitted to get married. I think, if I have this right. And there are different Eastern churches with different practices, so maybe there's some variation there. That's basically the way that worked out.
I'm just going to put a plug in. About 4 years ago, the Archdiocese approved, I'm part of a group called the Sarah Club of the Sidney, St. Mary's
Sure.
Deaneries,
Yep.
and Jennifer Sarah was, Ian and I were thrilled about that.
Yeah.
But our whole idea is mission, vocation awareness,
Right.
promoting vocation of all religious, nuns, sisters, brothers, whatever. So
Mhm.
when you brought up St. Jennifer
Yeah.
Sarah, we are very aware in this area, and our group is growing and supporting our priests and stuff. So
Yeah, good.
thank you for
The Sarah Club, yeah, I'm well aware of it. Does good work for an vocation, so yeah, anyone interested in that. Not to be confused with the Sierra Club.
right. We don't love trees. We don't love trees.
Right.
We pray for priests. We pray for priests.
Okay. We're over time, but if anyone wants to be courageous and ask another question, keep us longer. I'm happy to stay longer. Like I said, always happy to talk about church history, so, talk to me afterwards or shoot me emails or whatever.
Has the Catholic Church always referred to the period of time where Luther was separated out? Have they always referred to that as the Reformation, or did they use, it would seem to me like they would probably have referred to it differently at some point.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever had that question. I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, at this point, I've heard different terminology for it. So some people kind of a more, you might say more partisan Catholic view, we'll call it the revolution, the Protestant Revolution, which in a way, I mean, I think objectively you could say it was a revolution, but it tends to be a kind of, combative term at this point. Protestants don't like that. So, but at what point, that would be a historiographical question. In other words, at what point did church historians start even giving that period a name, and what did they call it? I have no idea what the answer to that question is. It's an interesting one because it would go to kind of perceptions of what was going on. I mean, it wasn't entirely clear at the beginning. We talked about the Eastern Schism. We talked about the other divisions within Christianity. It wasn't entirely clear what the character of that break was going to be, right? I mean, when Luther was excommunicated in 1521 or something pretty shortly after he posted the Theses, 1517, when he was excommunicated, it was clear something was going on, but just how big that was going to be and what was its nature going to be, that wasn't clear. So we still consider Eastern Orthodox sacraments to be valid, right? Ordination to be valid, apostolic succession to be valid. It wasn't entirely clear that the Protestant Reformation was going to be something different from that. But as it continued and as it got more radical or more different from Catholic theology and practice, then it became clear that we were talking about an entirely different sort of practice of faith.
Isn't it true that in 2000, 2001, something like around there, that the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church signed an agreement saying that the justification of faith that has separated us, we now we're in agreement on?
Yep.
Didn't that happen?
Yep. There's a joint agreement on justification. So that's part of the post-Vatican II history that I haven't had time to do, but I talk a lot about ecumenism because this is really a huge change after the Second Vatican Council all over the world, but in particular in the United States, because it's a dominant Protestant country with a large Catholic minority. This is a big question. So there's been all kinds of advances there. And yes, so one of the big theological questions that come out of the 16th century Reformation was, what is the nature of justification? Justification by faith alone, or is it by faith and works, or what does that mean? And that was, well, some people consider that to be the great theological divide in the 16th century Reformation. And in 2001, I'll assume you're right about that, sometime relatively recently, a joint commission of Lutheran and Catholic theologians, totally supported by the Pope, so this was all official. They agreed that, yes, some of their formulations and some of their language is different, but actually, our understanding of justification is adequately similar to be not, we're all on the same page, no problem. So this great theological divide disappears, but does that bring Lutherans and Catholics any closer together? Well, maybe a little bit, but the problem is you've had 400 years, right, of history and continued development of Catholicism going one way, Lutheranism going another way. So now we've got all of these other things. I mean, they're ordaining women, and they have all of these, they've abandoned various moral stances that the Catholic Church has held to. So there's all these other differences now. Okay, we can agree about justification. Well, now we've got to tackle A, B, C, and D. So unfortunately, there's still a long way to go before I think any kind of real unity is in sight. But those kind of things are good. I think they're promising. But it doesn't quite solve the problem. Kind of like Eastern Orthodoxy, I said, the Patriarch and the Pope lifted the excommunication, but we're still pretty far apart on all kinds of things. So that's what the passage of time will do. They go their separate ways, and then to bring it back together is very, very difficult. Okay? Thanks again for coming. Appreciate it.
I have just a few announcements before we all part. One, if you're here for Bukhari, just double, triple check, make sure you sign tonight, so I have everybody taken in. Two, Chrissy Schmiesing and family brought in some veggies up here, so help yourself as you go out if you would like them. And then I want to put some plugs in here, a couple of things that are coming up here. Holy Angels 1, I think Kevin spoke of High Mass. We will be having that next Thursday for St. John County. And so that's August 8th, 7 p.m. If you haven't been to High Mass, you do. And don't worry about taking the booklet. That's what I always tell people. We get so wrapped up in the booklet trying to follow that we forget we're in Mass, or at least that is for me. And I find a much deeper experience and encounter if I forget the booklet, trust that the priest is bringing Jesus, it's all good. But we would welcome all of you to come to High Mass next Thursday. Then on August 22nd, another Thursday, we have Wine, Women, and Jesus, and it is just for women. Sorry to disappoint you, gentlemen, but it is just for women. It will be at Murphy's at 7:30 p.m. So they're on the square, our new place there. And when you get there, we'll give you the little scoop of wine, Women, and Jesus, and also our first speaker will be Julia Ronan, who is a local author for our Catholic faith. And then coming up in November, all of you need to mark your calendars because you won't want to miss this. So we have been richly blessed at Holy Angels to have Father Nathan Cromley from the community of St. John to be able to come in. We will be doing 3 nights worth of mission talks. So it will begin on Sunday, November 10th. So November 10th, 11th, and 12th at 7 p.m. We'll be having more stuff come out. Probably utilize email and shout out email messages to you. There will also be a Friday morning on November 8th, a business and a leadership prayer breakfast up in McCartyville with Father Nathan. And then on Tuesday at 11:30 will be a women's luncheon with Father Nathan as well. But Holy Angels is sponsoring the mission talks for November 10th and 11th. He sets souls on fire, so come here, Father Nathan. And then finally, I'm just going to ask for all the prayer warriors out there. Our teaching team at Holy Angels Parish School is getting ready to set our own sails, and we are taking a pilgrimage. And we are going up to Our Lady of Good Health, the only Marian apparition in the United States. And we are making this journey. The teachers and our new principal, Father Amber, are making this journey to pray to our Blessed Mother, to lead our school, and guide us in the education up there. And so we'll be stopping at Mother Green's shrine in Chicago and praying and venerating with her. And then on the way back, on the feast day of St. Maximilian Kolbe, we will be with him. And then we will come back just after the midnight hour to say that we have arrived on Our Lady of Assumption. So it will be a beautiful journey, but we need lots of prayers for our teaching team and staff and for the great fruits that will happen from the pilgrimage. So any guys very much for coming and sharing. We're delighted, Kevin. Thank you for your time, energy, and effort, and love of the faith. So, one more hand to Kevin.
Nice to see you. How are you?